Well, thank you, Magdalena, for this gracious introduction. And I thank, can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. And I thank Sinfree for inviting me to speak to this forum. I take it as a distinction. Having listened to so many brilliant presentations before, and I'm a little bit nervous. I hope I will not disappoint you. And before I continue, I would like to acknowledge some friends that took some time to come and listen to me. I noticed John Ball is here, and Raj Mestri at the University of Cape Town is here, and my colleague, John Goldsmith, and I seize this opportunity to make a correction. I'm no longer the Frank J. McLaurin Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago. Now I hold, because John has retired and he had a higher distinction, so they passed on that distinction to me in giving me the title of Edward Carson Waller Distinguished Service Professor since January. And thank you, John. And John also has the distinction of having co-authored with a colleague, Bernard Lax, in Paris, a voluminous book called The Minefield. It's not a complete title, where you can find the history of our discipline. And I'm sure you'll be ready to correct me if I make a mistake today in talking about colonial linguistics. And the other person I would like to recognize is Michel de Graaf at MIT, with whom I have collaborated since the 1990s on many things regarding Creoles, and now about using what mother tongue in formal education. And so let me now explain the title, why I use the term iconoclast in the title, not to characterize anybody else but myself. Michel knows that I used to refer to myself as a heretic. But in 2011, I was a fellow at the Institute of Advanced Study at Lyon. And somebody, the director, encouraged me to apply for funding to do research on language endangerment around the world. It was an ambitious proposal, because the plan was to recruit experts around the world that could tell us stories about language, not just language endangerment, language vitality in the parts of the world, because I complained that there was too much of a Western and especially American perspective in the way that people deal with language endangerment today. And I was not funded, and not because the proposal was bad, but because they thought that actually I was asking for funding to develop an institute, and that was too much. And then one of the reviewers characterized me as an iconoclast whose views are difficult to refute. And it just reminded me that that's the kind of thing that I have usually done in Creole studies and in some other work regarding African languages. And so I have accepted the characterization with pride, and that's why I use it in the title. And regarding decolonial linguistics, I want to point out that I'm just jumping on the bandwagon because other people, including Sinfree Makoni and his colleague Alastair Pennycook, published a book. I think it was last year, Innovations and Challenges in Applied Linguistics from the Global South, and that is a wonderful contribution to decolonial linguistics as a way of questioning some of the working assumptions that pervade our discipline, the bias that we have inherited from the colonial period since linguistics started, and why we have to question some of those working assumptions. And also this year, there is a wonderful book edited by Ina Doimert, Anne Storch, and Nick Sheffer, called Colonial and Decolonial Linguistics, and to which I noticed that Cynthia Marconi also contributed a chapter along with myself. And while contributing to the book as a commentator, I noticed that not everybody that claims to do decolonial linguistics really does decolonial linguistics. It's not just a matter of saying there are too many studies, and the largest proportion of them that have been conducted by Westerners, by people from outside the former European colonies. It's a matter of sorting things out, checking what are genuine mistakes in the work that have in the current publications in the state of the art, what are the true European biases, and what are just honest mistakes that anybody could make, and so forth. And it doesn't amount to saying, well, such and such topic was not approached before, and therefore I'm going to deal with that kind of topic, and therefore this is decolonial linguistics. No, that is not necessarily decolonial linguistics. Finding a new topic of interest is just something that is quite independent from decolonial linguistics and so forth. So it's a delicate road that we are taking, in which we have to resist the danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And that is part of what I'm going to talk about. And I'm also going to share an anecdote with you from the early stages of my career. I submitted a paper to a refereed journal, and it was about Gala. And I noticed that the structure of Gala was quite different from what I had learned about English grammar. And this had to do with the intersection of the count mass distinction with how you use articles, definite article, indefinite article, or no article. And while working on Gala, I noticed that some of the differences actually arose from English itself, but in ways that the school grammars that I had learned had not been able to explain. And here Gala was helping me come back to English and say, maybe we haven't really dealt adequately with the count mass distinction in English, that the count mass distinction is not a property of a lexical property, but part of the grammar that goes along with strategies of specifying reference. When the editor wrote me and said, well, you are not a native speaker of the language, there are too many subtle distinctions there that you as an outsider may not grasp. And then at that time, we didn't correspond by email, so it took time, and I wrote back and I said, that doesn't really speak very well about linguistics if you think about it. Because the vast majority of languages around the world have been studied by Europeans, and the Europeans that wrote about these languages were not native speakers of these languages, and yet they are the ones that have developed the paradigms that we are following. So that was the end of the discussion. the editor was gracious enough to take back his comment and to publish my publication, my submission. So in other words, there are a number of people there that are open-minded enough to review the positions. It's a matter of how we articulate our points of views and how we address objections and so forth. And there is really ample room for change. That actually encouraged me to do many more things. And the editor and I actually became good friends because he encouraged me to submit more articles to his journal. So what I want to start with here is pointing out that linguistics as a discipline started in the 19th century. We credit Ferdinand de Saussure as father of modern linguistics. And I know there are other people that think that Chomsky is the father of modern linguistics. So it really depends on whose perspective. But for me, we can trace linguistics as far back, just as far as Western linguistics is concerned. Other people will go to Sanskrit. I won't go that far. But we can go all the way to the beginnings of the 19th century. And that's also the time when Europe was developing a strong interest in Africa, because in the colonization venture, the primary interest went to the New World, where Europeans developed settlement colonies. And then Africa, the Portuguese were interested in it, but for trade, and they went all the way to East Asia, but really didn't penetrate the interior of Africa until the 19th century. And for Asia, it was also the same, everything on the coast, and the Europeans didn't penetrate the interior either. But what happened is that there was a judge, a British judge, who went to India. And there's Sir Lawrence Jones, and he developed an interest in Sanskrit and discovered that Sanskrit had a number of features that it shared with European languages. People didn't speak of the Indo-European language family yet, just with European languages. And he compared those features to Latin and Greek and so forth. And that didn't jive well with people that thought that they were going to colonize Africa and Asia in order to bring civilization to them, that the people of Africa and Asia were inferior and inferior to Europeans and less evolved than Europeans. And speaking of those people being less evolved than Europeans, you find it in the work of Charles Darwin too. And Darwin sometimes characterizes Africans and Native Americans and non-Europeans in general as people that are less evolved. And you will be surprised to see that also in the work of Otto Jespersen, a characterization of non-Europeans as less evolved. And so the reaction, as I reported it in my 2008 book, Language Evolution, Contact, Competition, and Change, was that Indians couldn't possibly speak languages that share features with Western languages. They are backward people and so forth. And that was the first reaction to the idea of the Indo-European language family. It would take decades before Europeans changed their mind. And the objections that I report here are objections that occurred in the second half of... You hear me? Objections that were formulated like in 1875 and that is quite striking. So we have come a long way toward admitting people that are really not of the European stock, but share the same language family as Europeans and are grouped in the Indo-European family. And so, but the 19th century is the century of la mission civilisatrice. And in British English, it's the white man's burden, the responsibility that Europeans claim to bring civilization to us and to bring us under, to bring us from under evolution, so to speak. And we have to beware of the legacy of this kind of approach that we find in the 19th century. Of course, modern linguists have emancipated themselves from that kind of prejudice now, but there's a difference between emancipating one's views toward particular people and not paying attention to consequences to some of those biases that we have dismissed because they may continue. So the other thing that we find in the 19th century, we find it in the work of Friedrich von Schlegel, who made the comparison between isolating morphosyntax for people that are not linguists. So instead of saying John came, you say John and then the marker of past tense as a separate word and then come. Okay, and in John came, you have the fusional morphology. If you speak an agglutinating language, in one word, you would have the marker of person, the marker of number, you would have the marker of tense, all of them packed in one word. But in European languages, you do it differently, and that's the fusional system that I just described. And Schlegel had his own idea. His work was published in the mid-19th century, and according to him, it was either languages with isolating morphosyntax, and at that time he was familiar with Chinese, and he said Chinese must be a primitive language. And other people thought that it was agglutinating languages that were primitive. Nobody would think that there might be something odd with European languages, and people couldn't really think of typological variation in neutral terms. Nowadays, in my work, I say we can think of languages as technologies, that is, devices or strategies that you develop in order to solve problems. And one of the problems to solve is how to package information when you are communicating with each other. And different people solve problems in different ways. And there is really no significant reason for saying that way is less evolved than this way. Okay, you can just be happy with variation and try to explain the patterns of variation. But for Europeans in the 19th century, invested in la mission civilisatrice, they couldn't resist the temptation of saying the European languages are at the top, like the European race is the top, and everybody else is at the bottom, and you try to classify them. By the way, there's an interesting book that was published recently. I don't know if you can read the title there, Native Tongues, by Sean Harvey, published in 2018. And the subtitle is actually quite telling: Colonialism and Race from Encounter to the Reservation. And this is about the United States, how in the 19th century, the American administration was very much invested in studying Native American languages, but for the purpose of determining ethnic, or in that terminology, tribal groupings, and how to manage the expropriation of land from Native Americans on the basis of language, and push people to the reservations in groupings that made sense to them. But also among the arguments that you find in the book that Sean Harvey reports very well. He's a historian, by the way, but did a lot of work on philology and historical linguistics. You find a recurring theme that Native American languages are primitive and nobody should make an effort really to learn them. Ironically, the people that gave us ideas about Native American languages are people that went and married into the Native American population and learned Native American languages by immersion and so forth. But at that time, the attitude was whatever is too difficult for Europeans to learn must be primitive, inferior, and so forth. And so it's not just about Africa, Asia, but it's about all these territories that were being colonized and so forth. And the point here is we have to be very cautious when we investigate these languages that we are not so familiar with. And the danger is really to look at them, to approach them from the point of view of how the grammars that we are familiar with, basically those of Indo-European languages, and most of the time those of Western European languages. To what extent those languages are different from ours, and to what extent we are projecting categories in these languages that may not even exist as such in these languages. Remember, you're dealing with typology. If you think of languages as technologies, they can vary in a number of ways, and maybe wild ways we don't really know. The only constraint is what the mind is capable of processing, and what the mind may not be capable of processing. But otherwise, we are subject to prejudices that we may want to avoid. And then in a short while, I'll get back to what I mean by these particular prejudices. Something else in the 19th century, that's where Michel de Graaf and I come in. In the late 19th centuries, when the exploitation colonization system of Africa and Asia was in place, and to it the Pacific, the Europeans started noticing the ways in which the European languages had been modified in the colonies. They came to acquaint themselves with Creoles, and they came to acquaint themselves with Pidgins. And it was obvious to them that the European languages had been modified because of contact with non-European languages. So you would expect as a rational reaction that somebody would ask, did anything go wrong with how we accounted for the speciation / diversification of Indo-European languages? Because the speciation, the diversification of the Indo-European languages and the idea of the Stammbaum, in modern terminology, cladogram, was based on the comparative method. You compare lexical items, you compare morphemes that come with those lexical items, and you determine which languages are more closely related to one another. But as pointed out by Antoine Meyer, if the languages show such correspondences, it could be for any number of reasons. One of them is inheritance from the same proto-language, an idea that is very much cherished in genetic linguistics. Another reason is that, the same languages could have borrowed items from similar languages and would be modified in similar ways. And this is where we deal with language contact. Another reason could be homology, that by independent evolutions, they would wind up with similar things. In other words, you don't really jump to the Stammbaum or the cladogram without embedding your research in social history. But the reaction of the European genetic linguists, at that time we characterized them as philologists, was all those languages, the way they have been modified, they are just bastard tongues. And then when you read in particular French philologists, such as Charles Baissac, Julien Vincent, is it Julien Adam? They say, well, it's not a surprise. All those people speak inferior languages and they are incapable of learning the sophistication of European languages. That's why our languages have been modified to such an extent where we cannot recognize them anymore. That's the legacy of colonial linguistics. And what happened? This legacy has survived for long in Creole studies. And Michel de Grave came up with the term Creole Exceptionalist just to highlight this particular thing. When we verify history, a notion such as break in the transmission of the lexify is the language that gives the vast majority of the vocabulary to the Creole or to the Pidgin. And when you really check it carefully, even quite a bit of the grammar comes from the lexify, because the language varieties to which the Africans and people in the Pacific and people in Asia were exposed were non-standard varieties of European languages. In the European language family was constructed on comparing written varieties of European languages, not the non-standard varieties of European languages. And we have a partial history in the reconstruction of the Indo-European languages and so forth. So in a way, the discovery of Creoles and Pidgins was an opportunity for people doing Indo-European linguistics to re-examine things in order to do better genetic linguistics. And there are people that do that now, a century later or a century and a half later. But what we have to go back to that time in the late 19th century where prejudices toward population in the colonies prevented Europeans to do something better than they were doing. There are exceptions such as Hugo Schuckert, who kept telling them, hey, these Pidgins and Creoles are telling us how the Romance languages have evolved, for instance. Because Vulgar Latin wouldn't have been transformed into so many diverse languages if Vulgar Latin, assuming it was uniform, which it wasn't, but if Vulgar Latin hadn't come in contact with the Celtic languages in the colonies. After all, when you put things in perspective, in the case of the Romance languages, the Celts gave up the Celtic languages and shifted to the colonized language, just as the Africans did in the Caribbean, for instance, giving up the African languages and shifting to the European language. And moreover, this was in settings where the people shifting languages were in the overwhelming majority, just like on the plantations and so forth. Forget the fact that the Celts were at home, but the Africans were not at home. But these are things that we have to take into account and so forth. And I can go on and on and on. But at some point, for those of us that are interested in genetic Creolistics, concerned with how Creoles emerge and so forth, these are some of the biases that we still have to fight against. It's like when it comes to Creoles, unless the transmitters were Europeans, there must be a break in the transmission of the language. But the language needed be transmitted by people of the same race. A language needn't be transmitted by heritage speakers only. We talk a lot now about English being a global language. Who are the people that have played an important role in spreading English around the world? It's not just the Europeans. In the case of Asia, in 2015, I gave a lecture in New Delhi, and the title of my paper was about the role of India in spreading English around the world. Okay. It's often people like me in where I came from in the Congo. When I go back, I become the model of an English speaker, even though I may not be an impressive one here in North America, but this is how things evolve. And if you take the plantation settings, the people that really played an important role in the transmission of the European languages, you count among them indentured servants who were not necessarily native speakers of these languages. You count among them the Creole children, the Black Creole children who were born locally and learned the lexifier as a mother tongue, and who during the plantation phase would become the transmitters of these languages. So how could people stick to the idea that there was a break in the transmission of the lexifier when the evidence is all there that there couldn't have been a break in the transmission of the lexifier? In the work that I'm doing now about the emergence of pidgins in Africa, boy, what a surprise. There were so many unions between Europeans and Africans on the coast of Africa. And out of these unions were born a lot of mulatto children. And a category of women called the Signars, who were bilingual in European languages, in indigenous languages. And these are really the people that carried on the trade. And there couldn't have been a break in the transmission of the lexifier. And in the settings of Africa and Asia, you can't reconstruct situations where here an African and Asian that came with their slave or with this other community that they wanted to sell. And because they couldn't really communicate, voila, they started with the pigeon. The trade that produced pigeons was global trade on the model of trade today between, for instance, Microsoft and Germany or Belgium or whatever country you choose, or China. And it's not, the CEO of Microsoft or the ruler of the Ghana Empire or the Mali Empire who is involved in this. These people are trading through brokers. And the brokers are the people that have expertise in the local languages and so forth. And there was never a need for a pidgin for the trade to take place. Pidgins are a later emergence. It's not by accident that we notice that they flourished in the 19th century and not in the 15th century. There is no evidence of any pidgin in the 15th century. There is no evidence of any pidgin in the 16th century. And the earliest evidence of anything that we find approximating a pidgin comes in the 18th century. And when you look at the text, those texts are closer to European languages as they were spoken, non-standard European languages, mind you, than they are to the pidgins as we know them today that are more divergent from European languages. So a number of things that we have to deal with, and that's part of that colonial legacy. The other thing that I want to mention here is regards the identification of languages in Africa, and this is where Sinfi may step in. How did Europeans group African languages? And missionaries played an important role in this, because for Europeans, for the missionaries, it was a matter of how to group people in the territories in which they were going to proselytize, and finding a language that they thought was shared by a particular, widely shared in a geographical area, so that they didn't have to learn so many different languages and so forth. So they grouped these languages according to their convenience, not really doing it like the Indo-Europeans had done in applying the comparative method. Of course, there are people like Karl Meinhof that get in the picture also in the 19th century and try to classify African languages by language families. But for missionaries, it was a case of practicality. What are the languages that we have to capitalize on so that we can do our job well? And the colonial administrators took a piggyback ride on the work of missionaries and started identifying particular ethnic groups. This was also a time that coincided with Europe redefining itself politically in terms of one nation, one language ideology. And so this was particularly significant to them. So we find groupings of languages in Africa that are sometimes at odds with how people determine their ethnic identities, the people that have been given ethnic identities that are not really real to them. Where I come from, there is a particular language called Kikongo. Kikongo really doesn't exist. What exists are varieties that have been lumped together, like Kiyombe, Kiladi, and Kimanyanga, and varieties like that. And these languages are as mutually intelligible as the Romance languages are intelligible, if that means something to you. Okay, it's like me and Cecile traveling to Brazil, and when we wake up in the morning, people are speaking Spanish to us, and Cecile is a native speaker of French, and I turn to her and I ask her, can you understand? And she asked me, why do you ask me if I understand Portuguese? That's not my language, okay? But this is the kind of assumption that Europeans assume, carried over to Africa when they were grouping these particular languages. And why it was this way, I don't know. And I found out that something similar happened with the group of languages identified as Quechua in South America. And in many places around the world, you find this kind of thing. Okay, so now let me show, try to illustrate why approaching languages outside Europe with a European lens can be dangerous. Dangerous in the sense of leading us to the wrong analysis. One thing that has struck me is the way that a lot of textbooks have described the non-class markers in Bantu. And they usually they characterize them as, articles. Well, if they are really articles, they would be doing the kind of job that articles do in French or in English, but this is not what articles do, what non-class markers do in Bantu. Non-class markers in Bantu don't tell us anything about definiteness. You have to express definiteness by using a demonstrative, but not by the non-class marker alone. It's difficult to tell the count mass distinction just by the noun class marker. There are dedicated markers such as the plural markers marker in class 6. Okay, but the same marker in class 6 is also used for things that come in pairs. That doesn't correspond necessarily to the count mass distinction. Okay, and if you pay attention to the noun class marker, you find out that they have a derivational function. Like in some languages, the word for family is related to the word for parent, and it is related to the word for giving birth. So you use the same stem, but by changing the noun class marker, you convey a different kind of meaning and so forth. So there's something bad about just defining a noun class marker as a kind of article, because it sets the analysis in a different kind of frame that is misleading about what you want to investigate. And it even keeps you away from discovering things about how things work in that particular language. The other thing that caught my attention, for instance, and this was when I started working on Creoles, and people were talking about verb clefting, the talk, he, the talk, for instance. So that's the way that he is speaking, but the talk, he, the talk, and here you use the verb talk, the morpheme talk, with a definite article, and you put it at the beginning of the sentence. And because it is similar to clefting in English, most of the studies about this have been in English, but in English, you cannot put a verb in that position, and then you say, see, Creoles are just so different, and they will use even a verb in that position. But Creoles happen to have an isolating morphosyntax. They don't have these inflections and so forth. Here you have to deal with the zero morpheme or null morpheme. You can nominalize without putting anything on the verb in that particular position. It's the new construction that should give you a hint that you are not dealing really with a verb there, you are dealing with something different. And when you think about it, that the term in that focus position is nominal, then you will see that there are verbs that occur in that position, but they must be nominalized in English. It's his singing that I don't like. Okay, just like it's his voice that I don't like. But when you put a verb there, you have to change it into the gerund, and the gerund is a form of normalization. And when I went back to Bantu, that's precisely what I found. And there are two ways of nominalizing a verb in Bantu. One of them is to add the so-called infinitive noun class prefix. So the infinitive is nominal in Bantu, unlike the infinitive in English. But the other way is to just put the stem without a prefix. That's another form of nominalization. So there is really no verb clefting in Creoles. What you have is clefting, period. And then you have to deal with how, what really happens when you put a verb in that position. The other thing, here I think we have to recognize Bob Dixon about this. It's adjective, the category adjective. So the beautiful boy, the strong, the strong woman, and things like that. So that adjective. And in Bantu, it doesn't really work like that. Items that fall in the category of adjective are really a small set. In many ways, you use something that is similar to a relative clause. You use a verb. And a sick person is a person that has sickened. That's how you would say it, okay? Ripe fruit is a fruit that has ripened. And this is how you do it in Bantu languages. But when you read a lot of grammars, people are calling these things adjectives, and you start wondering what is the essence of an adjective. What are we learning here about language typology? So these are some of the things that we are challenged with. Serial verb constructions is another thing. We talk about serial verb constructions. Well, they are opposed to subordinated to subordination. Are they also opposed to complementation? That's really not a question mark. And the one thing about serial verb constructions is you have this concatenation of verbs. I shouldn't even use concatenation, succession of verbs without a conjunction or a preposition between them. So I tell him come in Gala. I told him to come, okay? And I ask come carry me to the hospital. I ask him to take me to the hospital, to come and take me to the hospital. And then when people define serial verb constructions, the usual explanation that I find is in these languages, you describe with many verbs what is expressed in English as an event. Boy, how do you know that the event boils down to the way things are formulated in English and not the way that things are formulated in a serial verb constructions? So in English, you can say, I cut the meat with a knife. But you also can say, I took a knife and cut the meat. Which one is truer to the notion of event? Or is it just a matter of variation in how you package information? Okay, so it's dangerous to just take the lens of an English grammar and project it to another language and present the other one as a deviation from English grammar, rather than presenting variation to court, that people package information in different ways, that what you may want to present as an event is not just one single event to the eyes of somebody else, and they put it differently. That even in your own language, you do have this option. Why do you dismiss it? Okay. And for me, working on different languages is an opportunity to go back and forth. There's this language I know, I want to see how it works in that language. Is it possible that that language may send me back to the language that I already know, and I may have to revise my analysis? And that's a step that has usually not been taken. And I think that is part of colonial linguistics. And the other thing is, and this will be my last point, English is the killer language by excellence, the killer language par excellence, and it's about to kill all the languages in the world. And l'Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie has taken advantage of this and trying to form partnership with African governments to fight the spread of English. But La Francophonie doesn't say anything about whether or not French may be a threat to African languages, because France is in there to promote French as an imperial language. But then you travel around the world, and in Africa, you notice English is not threatening indigenous languages. French is not threatening indigenous languages. And as a matter of fact, as you go around the world, you notice that everything is not proceeding the way it has in Europe. or the way it has in the Americas and in Australia, the things are evolving in different ways. And in Africa, it's some African languages that may endanger some other African languages. And in some cases, if you step back and you say, if things evolve this way, I don't think that French has much future in Senegal. I don't think that French has much future in the Democratic Republic of Congo, because in these places, Wolof is picking up steam and people are becoming more and more interested in Wolof and less interested in French, because in Kinshasa, Lingala is picking up steam and people are taking more and more pride in speaking Lingala and less pride in speaking French. And you can find examples all over. You can go to Nigeria and say Nigerian Pidgin English, which is, by the way, an indigenous language in Nigeria, although it is lexified largely by English, and Nigerian Pidgin English is picking up steam, and that may be to the disadvantage of English. So these are the kinds of things that we have to pay attention to. And what has struck me here, which I voiced in my publication in Language in 2017, is that there is too much of a Western bias, too much of an Anglo-Saxon bias that is really preventing us from learning language evolution from the point of view of language vitality. What are the factors that really matter, like economic power? And in Africa, English and French are doing poorly because there is no economic development. You don't trust reports such as economic growth. Economic growth doesn't mean anything when the people that are farmers, the people that have been disenfranchised from the European style economy are not really partaking in economic development. It's because they are frustrated, they have no interest or little interest in French and English, okay? And then, okay, people say, what's it? China is going to replace English. Well, wait a minute. For every 100 people learning Chinese, there are millions of people of Chinese learning English. And as Nicolas Osler has expressed it in his book, Empires of the World, it's the biased language, okay? And American companies trading with China are not trading in English, they are trading in Chinese. And Americans trading with Japan are trading in Japanese and not in English, and the other countries are doing the same way. So how things balance out, we really don't know. So far, English has benefited from places like India that count as Anglophone, even if only 30% of Indians speak English. But you see it in terms of close to 1 billion people, and people trading with India are investing in English instead of investing in Hindi. And that is favoring English in that particular respect. But you have to remember that millions of Chinese, the millions of Indians that are sticking to English and so forth. But then you go to Africa and you see the dynamics are quite different. And also the local dynamics in India are quite different and so forth. So it's time for us to step back and to say, wait a minute, the population structures of the different parts of the world are not identical. And we have to go and investigate things locally and not make projections from far away in the United States or from far away in Australia, because the colonization histories of these particular territories are not the same, okay? And so question here is, who practices colonial linguistics? It's not just Europeans or people of European descent. All of us trained in the European research paradigm may be applying colonial linguistics too. So my message here is not a discourse against people of European descent that are linguists. There are many of them that are doing decolonial linguistics too. The discourse here is for all of us trained in the European paradigm and the need for us to step back and put things in context and re-examine our analysis and so forth. So I think I'm going to stop here by saying again, we have to be cautious not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mufwene. Really, time flew with your fascinating lecture. Before I hand over to Dr. Makoni, there are two interesting comments. I don't know if you want to refer to them, Dr. Mufwene, about the last topic you've been mentioning, the spread of Chinese trade and the spread of Chinese language. So one is from Dr. John Baugh, and the other from Dr. Cecile Vigoureau. I don't know if you can all, did you read it?
Yeah, China has been in Africa for a very long time. This is from Cecile. When you go to many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Chinese traders speak African vernaculars. I think we should confuse the extent of economic market. We should not confuse the extent of an economic market with the spread of a language. Ethnographic work shows that dynamics are much more complex, and that is very true.
I was responding to John before. You need to look at John's message.
Okay.
China is investing heavily in the spread of Chinese.
Yeah, China is investing heavily in the spread of Chinese in many African countries, coming in the form of trade agreements, building schools, hospitals and roads, and the spread of Chinese is a clear goal. And I can respond to this. Actually, it is related to what I read from Cecile Vigoureau, in the sense that here too the principle of biased language applies. Yeah. And the Chinese in Africa are interacting with the Africans in African languages when they can learn them, or the people at the low level of the system actually learn African languages and they speak them very well. But people at the higher level of the system, they invest in the official language of the country, like in the Congo and in Senegal, they learn French, and in Zimbabwe, they learn English. But the reason why there are so many Confucius institutes is because Africans want to go to China, and they are going to need Chinese when they go to China. So that's really the way it works. The difference between Europeans and the Chinese is that the Europeans, probably because of the colonial history, they didn't invest that much in African languages and just thought that it was enough to teach Africans the European language, but they did it also in a strange way. European colonization in Africa and Asia proceeded by intermediaries. The late William Samarin used to speak about colonial auxiliaries, and the colonial auxiliaries are the low-level administrators and teachers who were indigenous, and people in the police force too that were not officers and so forth. And these are the people that interface between the local population and the European colonizers. So a lot of European colonizers didn't really interact directly with the Africans. And there are a lot of places in Africa where people don't have a clear idea of what European culture is and things like that. European culture, this is really a terrible overgeneralization, but what French culture is or what Belgian culture is and things like that. So the difference is really in approaches. And that's why when you study Africa, you will find out that the proportion of Africans that speak European languages has been very low. It hardly exceeds 20%. There are a couple of exceptions like Gabon and Angola. Gabon goes up to 80%, but because they never developed an indigenous lingua franca, and Angola goes up to close to 50% for reasons that I don't know, but everywhere else it's really around 20%. And when you consider the fact that African countries have been independent for over 60 years now, and education has been in European languages, you wonder how much money and how much time has been invested, because in over half a century, the proportion of people learning and becoming competent in and practicing European languages has remained very low. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much for this answer, Dr. Mufwene. I see Dr. Simpri Makoni is ready to ask his question. I also see Dr. John Goldsmith raising his hand. I don't know if your comment, Dr. Goldsmith, is about the last comment, or is it a different question?
I think what we could do is just allow Dr. Goldsmith to come in. Since I'm going to summarize it, and I'll have a chance to take part.
Thank you. So Dr. Goldsmith, over to you. You are muted.
There, okay. Yeah, my comment was more general. Salikoko, that was such a wonderful talk. And I'd like to emphasize how much your work over the last 25 years has spoken to the importance for linguists of looking at the history of the times in which we live and in which the last 150 years, it's so important to understand the political and the economic and the social history of these times, because they have a deep impact on the way we do linguistics, and most linguists aren't teaching it. They're not teaching it because they don't understand it. They don't know it. But your work has always, in the last 25 years, underscored that. And I've, especially in the book that you mentioned, The Battle in the Minefields, tried to emphasize the same way of looking at 19th century linguistics. And I think it's helpful to understand that from the European point of view, the 19th century was the century of history. And the reason it was a century of history, and people at the time called it that, was because of the rapid change in the economic and political nature of Europe. We could begin with the French Revolution, and then Napoleon, which obviously was a development of that as well. And Napoleon marched out on the rest of Europe in the first decade of the 19th century in an effort to break down feudalism, in an effort to break down the Holy Roman Empire. And the result of that was the effort on the part of many people in Europe to create new nations. And the linguistics was a very important tool in the creation of a national consciousness. So the languages which today seem like standards were far from it. They were vernaculars spoken by nobody in a serious professional situation. You could even think of Czech, for example, in a context like that. And so the concept of evolution, you see it in a philosopher like Hegel, who was looking at political revolutions, turning it into a philosophy. Evolution was on everybody's mind. And in the third generation of linguists, which is the generation of neo-grammarians, things were beginning to change because of the rise of laboratory psychology. And for the first time, people started to think about language maybe as reflecting a universal species-specific way of thinking. And so this new way, this kind of structuralism, the term wasn't used at the time, but starting with the neo-grammarians and then Saussure, and into the 20th century, the rise of cognitive approaches to language. This was in turn a response to this, what today we would sort of call a hyper-evolutionary view of things. But there were certainly anthropologists like Boas and others in the 20th century who reacted against the evolutionist bias towards seeing a single ladder which all cultures and societies had to climb up, and a reaction to saying, no, that's not the way it is. More in line with, as you put it, Salikoko, at the beginning of your talk, we need to recognize and appreciate the variety across human cultures. So I just want to thank you for emphasizing the importance for all linguists of thinking seriously about the historical context, both in which they work and also in which the peoples and languages they're studying have evolved.
Okay.
Thank you very much, John. All I can say to complement your underscoring what I was doing is that it is thanks to Saussure that we could do language typology, because by focusing on structure, then people could really see how synchronically the structures could vary so much from one language to another. Thank you.
Lynn Mario, do you have something to say?
No, not yet.
Not yet. Okay, let me jump in then. I have two questions, Sally, that I want to ask. The first one is a very general question that kept bugging me as I read your work and as I was writing some of the material that I'm currently working on language in the global South. I kept coming back to your work on decolonial linguistics, and I want you to help me think this through. What is the nature of the relationship that we are positing, or that you think might emerge between theories of language from the global South and notions about decoloniality? Because why I'm asking is this, is that at least in my writing, I tend to move between these two different frameworks, and I'm not yet sure what exactly are the connections between the two. So I thought perhaps you might help me clarify this, these two sets of ideas.
Okay, have you finished?
Yes, I finished, yes. I just want you to help me think these ideas through, whether in actual fact they are related or these are completely different. What?
I think they are related. You know, I tend to talk about theory and the growing diversity of languages being investigated as what an expansion of opportunities to create a dialogue between hypotheses and facts.
Okay.
And so since the 1950s with Noam Chomsky, we have become very much interested in universals of language. But Noam Chomsky developed his hypothesis on universals, not so much on the model of Joseph Greenberg, but mostly in terms of language and the mind, how the mind works, and largely on his knowledge of English. And a lot of people were fascinated by Chomsky's ideas and went on to investigate a number of languages. And when you follow the track, you will find out that this is where you find a lot of colonial linguistics, because a lot of people out there were just trying to see to what extent the language did some of the things that Chomsky had pointed out about English and so forth. You know, if you take syntactic structures in 1957, and then aspects of the theory of syntax, I think in 1965, and then you come to principles and parameters, this is in the early 1990s. How long did it take people doing linguistic theory to become sensitive to the idea of typological variation? You know, and Greenberg had already talked about this in the early 1960s. And so I think the message that I want to convey is, you know, people have to put their feet on the ground and say, wait a minute, this is not the way it's working in my language. You know, there are probably universal, but we would like to have a clear idea of how to talk about universals. And this is what we should be doing from the global South. One thing that has struck me particularly is how the Japanese talk about reflexive pronoun in Japanese. The item that they identify as a reflexive pronoun is nothing like a reflexive pronoun in Bantu languages, a reflexive affix. And it is not like a reflexive pronoun in French, because you can have this item in the subject position, and that's not a place for the reflexive pronoun in languages that have a reflexive pronoun. And the other thing is that, and what people identify as a reflexive pronoun in Japanese actually means referring to the nearest antecedent. And the nearest antecedent may be in the preceding sentence in a discourse. This is a discourse phenomenon. And it is not subject to the same constraints as a reflexive pronoun in English.
Salikoko, I'm going to jump in, and I apologize for doing so, but I'm mindful of the time. And my question is related. First, I apologize because I am not as well versed in many of these issues as you are. And your work and Michelle's work has been strongly influential in my own thinking. And so I have a very naive question as someone who is not a Creole scholar. But it seems to me that Derek Bickerton tried in his formulation of the bio program to wrestle theoretical linguistics into a place where the serious consideration of Creole languages was also taken seriously. I think you do a much better job than he did in some ways, but I don't know if the bio program has been debunked or refuted. Is Bickerton's work in any way connected to the same mission that you're pursuing?
Yes, Bickerton actually got me thinking, because when I started my research on Creoles, Bickerton is the person that I found the most convincing. But Bickerton made no allowance for substrate influence. And the same way that Robert Chaudanson in France insisted very much on the legacy of the lexifier, but made no allowance for substrate influence. I convinced Robert Chaudanson to think otherwise, and he did. But Bickerton and we kept locking horns to no clear end, except that in his last book before he died, he gives me some credit for something. I think that Bickerton deserves the credit of getting us to think harder. But he made the mistake of saying that it's only children that have access to the bio program. And the bio program plays no more role when you become an adult. It's like, you know, saying, oh, my computer is working, let me go and take away the underlying language. If you do that, you know what will happen to your computer. You won't have a computer. So, and I kept saying, if there is a bio program, it must stay alive throughout a speaker's life. Otherwise, the person won't be able to speak. And the other thing is that he was very Chomskyan and very much frustrated that Chomsky didn't recognize him in saying, you know, we find in Creole grammars the pristine grammar. And that is not true. You know, a lot of features that Bickerton would associate with the bio program, you find them most systematically used in languages such as Chinese, and not so systematically used in Creoles. And Creole just reflect that hybridization of inputs coming from different areas. People have criticized me of not underscoring the role of Africans enough in the emergence of Creoles. Au contraire, what I have said is that Creoles wouldn't have become different from the kin varieties developed by whites in the colonies if it hadn't been for the influence of African languages. Even the principle of selection, as I have hypothesized in my feature pool model, factors in African languages because they determine which features you are going to favor in the lexifier if you don't introduce any more features. My objection to the extreme substratist view is like the African must be incapable of learning anything European. And that's why we find all this. That is as terrible as what Bickerton was trying to suggest. Like, and I had a bad exchange with him when I reviewed his book. What was it? The title of the book again. But I said, Bickerton talks about Africans like the adults just were living bestially on the plantations without any communication and waiting for them to have children, and the children made the language for them.
Ouch. Ouch, bro.
Right.
Wow.
Yes. And then, you know, he got very upset about it too. So, so these are the kinds of things that we have been trying to wrestle with. So as far as I'm concerned, Bickerton bio program is dead. But, okay, you know, you have to go and talk to somebody else that doesn't believe me.
Okay, thank you, Sally. Nice job. Great talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Makoni, if you agree, we have Ronke that
that's fine.
put a message and also has the hand up. And also we have a question from Sangeeta. So after that, we could finish the formal session with your last comment, Dr. Makoni.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Professor Mufwene, for that wonderful lecture, very informative for me. I'm not a linguist, and so my question will not have all the razzmatazz, but I'm just happy to have such a renowned linguist in front of me. My first question, I had put it there. I said, Professor, isn't vernacular a derogatory word? I would like you to answer that.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because, yeah, vernacular has been used in like cultural studies in a slightly different way. Vernacular in linguistics means the language that you use for day-to-day communication, especially in the family environment and with your close friends and so forth. That's a vernacular. You can compare it to the attire that you put on at home in order to feel comfortable instead of the suit or, you know, the highly styled dress that you put when you are in the street. So,
okay, but yeah. I never hear people talk about European vernaculars today.
Oh, well, I did in a different way by referring to non-standard varieties in order to explain why Creoles are the way they are. Creoles did not evolve from the standard varieties that people insist on. And in my work, I prefer to call them scholastic varieties A lot of us non-native speakers will learn European languages at home and not in the West. We learn scholastic varieties, and when we write well in them, then Europeans deride us and say you speak bookish English or bookish French or something like that, or your French is too flowery, because we learn it from les belles lettres of literature. We thought that people speak like that, and they don't speak like that. But yeah, but yes, when I write, I also mention European vernaculars.
Okay, let me ask my main language, my main question.
Yeah.
I appreciate your reminding us again that language is a technology for storing information. I am a gender scholar, and I have been interested in the whole question of gender and language. And so when you talk about language as a technology and that different languages approach that in different ways, I wonder whether at this point, and I don't know whether in linguistics people have debated this, I wonder whether at this point people have revisited, scholars have revisited what I used to know as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis to enlighten us as to why some languages focus on certain things and not others. I wondered whether in your work you have addressed such a question. Then my other question, which is a very short one, and that of a very lay person, I get the impression that generally speaking, the place we've designated as Europe had fewer languages. Maybe at a particular point in time, maybe we should say, let me say the 16th century, in comparison to Africa and Asia, where they seem to have so many more languages. Could you speak to that, please, as a linguist? Thank you.
Okay, I'll start with the last one. I'm writing a book now on the subject matter, and it is so subversive that I'll be lucky if it is published in time. But Europe has so few languages because of its history of colonization. We don't really think of Europe as a territory where there was colonization. In my approach to language evolution, I say this, since the exodus out of Africa, the history of mankind has been one of layers of colonization. And you have interpreted colonization here in two ways. One is just to settle another territory. And the other one is the one that we are more familiar with. You settle another territory and you subjugate the population that preceded you in that particular territory. And I think the previous one, the first definition is less controversial, but that's the one that you find in population genetics, for instance. But the second one that we are more familiar with, we don't think of the Roman Empire as a form of colonization, but it is a form of colonization. We don't think of the Hellenic Empire as a form of colonization, but it is a form of colonization. We don't think of the Germanic populations invading England as a form of colonization, but it is a form of colonization. So there's been a lot of internal colonization. Actually, when you approach things like this, you even develop a better understanding of the diversification of the Indo-European language family, because it's a consequence of those migrations, population movements, and layers of colonization. So nobody tells us about how many Celtic languages died because of the emergence of the Romance languages, because the Celts were shifting to Latin. And after that, how many Neo-Latin varieties actually emerged? And then they competed with each other until the French of Ile-de-France, the Parisian French, prevailed as the language of France, you know. And in Spain, it's more or less the same thing. And by the time the colonization of the New World starts, actually, Spain didn't exist. Spain arises as a country around the same time as New Spain emerges in what people retrospectively have called New Spain. In the New World, it was Castile, Galicia, and you know where Barcelona is, Catalonia, and all these territories. These are the spaces, the political spaces that existed. But you see, put things in perspective, these have been in competition with each other and so forth. And Catalonia doesn't want to be superseded by Galicia, by Castile, I'm sorry. So you put things in this perspective, you realize there's always been colonization, and that colonization has been at the cost, at the expense of something. And one of those is the loss of the Celtic languages and the loss of languages like Sami in Norway. And you wonder how Basque has survived for so long. So that gives us an idea of what happened in Europe. And it happened earlier than the kinds of changes that would take place in the New World, where Native American languages are disappearing because they are being replaced by English. It doesn't really make much sense when you put things this way. How you have to put it in terms of economic development, in terms of political pressures, and in terms of population structure, whether the population is segregated or not segregated, whether the dominant population is assimilationist or not assimilationist. And that's why you can understand why there are so few languages in Europe, because Europeans in Europe have been traditionally assimilationist when they spread to relocate in new territories and so forth. And they did the same thing. They have done the same thing. I should put it in the present perfect. They have done the same thing in the New World, in Australia, in displacing these languages. And by the way, it's not just Native American languages that have been displaced. It's other European languages that were not dominant. So German is no longer alive. Italian is no longer alive in North America. Dutch is no longer alive in North America, and so forth. And Europeans actually started losing their languages before Native Americans started losing their languages. It tells you a whole lot about segregation and discrimination in the New World and the marginalization of indigenous populations. I'm not counting here cases where Native American languages died because of ills introduced to the population from the Old World, or because of genocides committed, for instance, by the Spaniards in Central America and in the Caribbean. So you get an idea of why there is more diversity elsewhere. I use a less developed and sophisticated typology of colonization, make a distinction between trade colonization and settlement colonization, such as in the Americas and Australia, and then exploitation colonization. There's the colonization of Africa and Asia and the Pacific since the 19th century. And exploitation colonization was grounded on segregation between the indigenous people and the colonizers. And it was non-assimilationist because the main purpose of the exploitation colonization, according to me, was to fuel the Industrial Revolution in Europe and things like that. And Europeans were better off with Africans becoming fluent in European languages and not understanding a whole lot of what a whole lot of what was going on and so forth. So that more or less answers your question. But about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, yes, the idea of languages as technologies is quite consistent with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, because the representation systems that different people develop needn't be the same. First of all, the natural ecologies in which they live are not necessarily the same. And the adaptive responses to these natural ecologies need not be identical. I can make things a little bit more complex. If you take 2 or 3 individuals and you put them in the face of the same challenge, they are not going to react necessarily in identical ways. Okay, and there is variation. And what goes on in a population is that we keep comparing ourselves with others, and we can give up our own solutions and adapt the solution of somebody else because it works better, or they can do the same. Eventually, we converge toward doing things in similar ways, never in identical ways. And so when we describe worldviews and so forth, the way that Edward Sapir and what is his first name, Whorf did, when we speak of those worldviews, we are overgeneralizing and overlooking variation within. Otherwise, yes, I think that this perspective can give us stronger motivation for pursuing the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. However, the fundamental problem remains. That is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis deterministic, or is it non-deterministic? So deterministic means you have mindsets that have been fixed and from which it could be difficult to emancipate. And the non-deterministic view tells you, we don't really know what the nature of the language of thought is. We don't really know how a conceptualization works and so forth. However, when we communicate, there are some convenient ways in which we package information. And we have to package information in ways that make it easier for each one of us communicating with each other to interpret each other very fast and effectively. And I have been in favor of the non-deterministic approach to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. But there are people that suggest otherwise, and we may agree to differ, or we may continue to fight and try to convince each other.
Thank you for this answer. We are already actually in our after party time, but we had Sangeeta waiting for a long time to ask her questions. So please, Sangeeta, go on. And then Lynn Mario, in the after party, please feel free to ask or make your comment.
Thank you for this. And I don't know, given the time, I would love to kind of comment some of the things you have said, but I'll stick to the 2 questions I put up in the chat. So I'm a bit concerned about the way in which everyone is in this decolonial linguistics bandwagon, and you started your talk with that. My question is related to, how do you differentiate between decolonial linguistics and colonial linguistics? So that's question 1. And perhaps related to that, in your 2021 commentary, you raise interesting issues regarding the difference between what you call Western biases and what you call mistakes. And you're commenting a particular number of chapters in this book. Can you give a couple of examples of what you mean by Western biases, what you mean by mistake?
the Western bias, it has to do with, for instance, imposing categories of one language onto another language before you really have examined the data. It's the data that should be suggesting what categories are going to work, and not your knowledge of another language that should determine what categories you have to work with. That's the Western bias. So I gave an example with the noun class system in Bantu, why it is different, how it is different from the article system in European languages. They don't do the same jobs. And this is related to the question about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. There are certain things that are more important to some people than to some other people. And so what is considered less important is not really packaged in the information that you convey to the other, you know. Or if it becomes important, you have to use a different kind of strategy. I don't know if this answers your question. The difference between decolonial linguistics and colonial linguistics is you have to interpret decolonial linguistics more or less the way that Jacques Derrida speaks of deconstruction. It's not necessarily to reject things, it's to see how the paradigm that has been offered works, and to see what can be changed in it, or what must be changed in it in order for it to help you deal with other languages. And the converse of that is, how can you enable the new language that you are investigating to talk back to your theory, in suggesting how the theory can be adjusted, can be modified so that it will do a better job. That's really a short way of answering your question. And so, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, coming up with a subject matter that has not been dealt with before is not necessarily doing decolonial linguistics. If you find something interesting in a language and you notice that theories, hypotheses that you know have not dealt with that particular subject matter, and you start dealing with it, that is just a contribution to the research paradigm. It is not necessarily decolonial linguistics. Or if somebody made a mistake, even according to the paradigm that they have used, and you are not necessarily changing the paradigm, you are just making a correction to somebody's research. So the thing about, I gave the example of the count-mass distinction in Gala, and it's because I noticed, for instance, people can say, what, for instance, I go to boys' store. And this was an occasion where people were criticizing somebody because he had no children and there was nobody to celebrate him on Father's Day. And so his friends criticized him, so they were teasing. And his friends told him, you should go to boys' store and find a child there, and so forth. So boy is used here as a mass noun. And according to the grammar that I had learned, you cannot use boy as mass. And then check, I check, and then you hear somebody say in English, you know, you arrive at an intersection and there was a car accident. And you say, boy, there was car all over. Okay, does it make sense to you? It's very English. There was car all over. And you are using car as if it were a mass noun and so forth. I call it non-individuation, okay? And that's how I started checking whether there were things that were not really adequately explained in English itself before I could make sense of what was going on in Gala. So there's a story, for instance, in Animal Tales, in Gala Animal Tales, and Patrice, let's say Patrice, is asking Wolf, Brother Wolf, how you want to kill me? So Gwyn is going, how you want to kill me? With knife? That's the pronunciation of knife, like in Australian English. And so when you take with knife, in English, you would ask with a knife, right? But it turns out that in the grammar of Gala, there's a difference between a knife and knife. Knife means you don't really know what particular knife you're going to use. A knife, there is a knife somewhere that is available to you, and it is specific for you, but not to me. And so the question, you get that kind of difference. The difference between, like in Jamaican Creole, ima teacher, ima the teacher, or im a teacher, okay? And so ima teacher and im teacher, you translate it the same way in English, he's a teacher or she's a teacher. But there's a difference. One of them describes the profession, and the other one describes the individual that assumes a profession. So in the end, you realize that Creole grammars, too bad John Boy is already gone. He asked me the question about Bickerton. You'll find out that Creole grammars are not as simple as we think they are. They just have been restructured in ways that display different patterns and different systems. Not all the rules being different, but you get these other nuances in Creoles that you wouldn't have thought of just by studying the lexicon. Yeah.
Thank you. I think I was coming from somewhere else, and there is this horrible echo now. So from a performative angle, and I think the previous question, set of questions from gender studies, for instance, also kind of are hinting to this, that there is a time-space difference. So I wonder whether you would agree that it is not the languages of the global South, but languages everywhere that can be approached through what is being called decolonial linguistics. And I'm reminded of my colleague, Catherine Hoppers, who was decorated in my previous university in Sweden. About 15 years ago, she was invited as a keynote for the Swedish Research Council, an annual event. And she made a very provocative statement, which a number of my colleagues and I particularly was very taken up by that. She was not talking of linguistics or language, but of the positionality of bodies across spaces. And she highlighted that dogs from outside Europe are now situated and barking in Europe. And it was only in the dinner at this particular event that we could talk about what Catherine was saying. And it is, and Sweden is a very specific geopolitical space because we have not been allowed to talk about racism here in attempts to not recreate racism. So what Catherine pointed out then is very close to the title of your talk, and which is why I raised this issue of how do you differentiate between decoloniality and coloniality in linguistics. And I think for me, linguistics is much more than just the grammars of different languages and the places in which languages have existed. And digitalization, for instance, opens up to questioning what is place.
Yeah, you are very right. Linguistics is about more than the grammars of languages. And even so, I think it depends also on how you define grammar, whether you just say it's syntax, morphology, and semantics and so forth, and don't include pragmatics or include pragmatics. But I have another retired colleague who just said he doesn't like the term sociolinguistics And the reason is there is no linguistics without sociolinguistics. And his point to me was language must be grounded in its population and in its history. So there is a whole lot that comes with that. I think that if you come from a former colony, it's cute to use the term decolonial linguistics, or if you empathize with people that have been colonized, it's also cute to use the term decolonial linguistics. And I think this goes along with Sinfree's term, the Global South, the title here, Applied Linguistics from the Global South, in the sense that the South, the Global South must stand up and voice their views. That's really what it means. It's the political dimension that we have to see into it. If we had all been equal, we wouldn't need the term decolonial linguistics. We would just need Derrida's notion of deconstruction. And that would just do the job. That's my point of view.
All right, I see one more question from Lynn Mario de Souza, after which we'll go ahead and wrap up.
Okay, well, it's not really a question. It's a comment. And it's related to what you just said, Professor, and related to the previous comment by Angita. I'm not sure if you can, I'm getting an echo.
A little bit.
I'm trying to find who has the echo.
Okay, it's a comment on how I, located in South America, understand decoloniality, and I think it's connected to, you raised right from the beginning the issue of how the importance of historical context. You spoke about the problem of when we look at language not from a native speaker's point of view, but from a non-native speaker's point of view, and how that led to misunderstandings, and from Europeans looking at African languages. And then you speak about paradigms and biases. From a decolonial theoretical point of view, all of these refer to something important, which is the importance of epistemology when we are talking about, or we are thinking languages or linguistics. So it's not so much to do with if you're European, or if you're African, or if you're from the global north or the global south. It's what epistemology are you located in, and that is orienting your thinking about language. I think that's what's most important, rather than locations, geopolitical locations, because these geoepistemic locations are probably more important. And here I just like to remember what an Indian sociologist, Lakshman Khubchandani, a critique that he used to make about Indian sociolinguistics, or the way that Indian linguistics looked at language. He said, these guys are looking at language from a European point of view because they learned linguistics from the British, right? So the way that they theorize Indian multilingualism is from a European perspective. So it's not even though they are Indian, they're thinking language as Europeans, right? So I think it's this epistemological dimension which we try to recuperate in decolonial linguistics, rather than simply trying to react against the colonial linguistics. Because within this, we can see that there may be Indians or Africans performing colonial linguistics, as there are non-Indians or non-Africans performing decolonial linguistics. That's just a comment, and I'd be interested in your reaction to that.
Dr. Mufwene, you're muted still.
I think that we agree. One of the things I said when I concluded my presentation was, who does colonial linguistics? And I said, You know, it could be all of us that have been trained in the Western paradigm, and we may be practicing it. So decolonial linguistics speaks not just to Westerners, but to everybody. We have to step back and question ourselves and see whether we are doing the right thing. And Sangeeta was correct. It's you know, maybe we don't need the term decolonial linguistics, but there's, you know, sometimes it helps to have this political perspective that a person from the global South coming to study in the global North is more likely to be influenced by views of the global North than the other way around, where a person from the global North goes, relocates in the global South, especially during the colonial period. A whole lot of things developed this way because colonization was very influential. And the message simply is we have to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery, as Bob Marley said it. You know, I have a sign in my office, and the words from Bob Marley is emancipate yourself from mental slavery. It speaks to what you are saying there.
Dr. Mufwene, did we want to wrap up? What do you think?
I'm sorry?
Oh, no, I was just asking Dr. Mufwene if we should go ahead and wrap up.
Okay, let me just say one or two things and then we can wrap up. Thanks a lot, Sally. My view about this, I think, is sort of fairly simple. My view is that what we're engaged in at the moment, I think, in decolonial linguistics is an exercise in epistemological and ontological framings of what we think we're trying to do. So, for example, one way of thinking about decolonial linguistics might simply be to say to yourself, okay, how do I carry out linguistics, for example, if I seriously consider issues about land as interlocutors, if I ask completely different questions? So what decolonial linguistics provides you is with at least some freedom to ask questions which are not obvious to linguists who are not operating in a decolonial framing. In a decolonial linguistics, I may seriously consider land as an interlocutor. So I then ask myself, how do my practices as a linguist shift if land is seen as an interlocutor? Then the other thing that comes up from all this is what decolonial linguistics provides you also is with an opportunity to reimagine other ways, other more critical ways of being and talking about language. So, for example, the argument that Sally was making was that some of the categories that we use in linguistics, for example, force us to see language in a very specific way, thus rendering us blind to other workings of language. So what a decolonial linguistics does is to force us to get back to the meta language and say that the meta language itself should be a way and an important project that we should be engaged in. Then the other last thing that I would just like to say is that what a decolonial linguistics should seek to try and do, amongst other things, is to redefine language using indigenous epistemologies. But having said that, I'm not claiming that there are untainted, untouched indigenous epistemologies out there which can try and help us rescue an overheated, like Jean Comorable put it, an overheated metropole. But we are simply creating some space for other epistemologies, but being cautious enough to realize that, yes, these epistemologies do not provide you with a solution, but simply an indicator of where you might go. Yeah, thanks a lot. Vishna, do you want to tell us